Morning and a welcome to, you may not have been, our Center of Hope and then our Assembly Hall up here. It's just a great room. Really love it. And I love teaching in front of the screen. Makes me look good. It's great. And welcome to those of you who are here. And we know, as always, there are many who will watch the video later on. So welcome to you guys. Thank you for joining us. And I am up front this morning with my friend and colleague, Reverend Taylor Pryde Barefoot.
Good morning. Good to see you all.
Taylor came back from Great Britain. She was on a Wesley tour with a bunch of other clergy and our bishop. And she was really jazzed up and excited about it. And I said, well, let's tell people about this. So we have decided to do this together. And we decided to name it Why We Love John Wesley. Now, I have to confess to you, he does not look lovable. And I think he was a lot like this painting with this captured. He was like a severe, serious guy. We'll talk more about that. Anyhow, Great Britain. Christianity came to Great Britain, way back 5th century. Today you can visit fabulous places like Iona. It's a little island just it's just off the western shore of Scotland from Oban, famous for its whiskey, of course. And Christianity largely was founded there, and then also on the East Coast at a place called Lindisfarne, and all kinds of monasteries grew up that you can visit. This is Melrose in particular. Cathedrals were built through the Middle Ages. This is Durham, my favorite. And Christianity began there with, it spread, and by the time the Wesley comes along, Christianity, like Christianity in America today, it was a mixed bag. You had Puritans hanging around who were deadly serious about the faith. And you had a lot of people that we would call deists. Like they would say, well, there is a God, but God's not really personal or much involved in the world. In England, people were part of, the Church of England. John Wesley's father was a priest in the Church of England. Wesley became a priest in the Church of England. His brother Charles became priest in the Church of England. And to use modern parlance, I always like to say there were churches in those days, and everybody was part of one, but you would say those churches were, we'd say, dead. People sort of went through the motions. There wasn't a lot of vitality. Part of what Wesley's genius was bringing the vitality. So on Taylor's trip, they visited a place called Epworth, where the rectory, where the Wesley family lived, exists, and they got to see it. You don't have to go all the way to England, though. At Lake Junaluska, somebody gave money, and they built an exact replica of the Epworth Rectory. I've never been inside there. Lisa, have you been in there?
No, I think they're counseling offices.
Anyway, so the Epworth Rectory, where John Wesley's parents, Samuel and Susanna, lived, they had 19 children. John was the 15th of 19 children. Of course, back in those days, a lot of kids didn't survive. I think 9 didn't survive out of infancy, toddlerhood, and so on. Wesley was born on June the 17th of 1703. It was nicknamed Jackie. And Taylor wants to tell you about what happened at this parsonage when John Wesley was 5 years old. Jackie was 5 years old. A real dramatic turning point in his life. So, Taylor.
Sure. So I will say, when I was invited on this trip, I had no expectations. I've read about John Wesley, learned about John Wesley from scholars. So when I showed up in these places, I was an absolute blank slate. And I was honestly surprised, experiencing some of these things, at how moved I was. And John Wesley's near-death experience was one of those moving things, because I guess I missed that day in Duke, or they didn't teach us. But I had not realized that we almost didn't have John Wesley. There was... And this is hypothetical, they're not sure if this is true or not, but they think someone in their church had lit their parsonage on fire, and...
This is not a go thou and do likewise.
Yes, yeah.
Thing.
And they thought all of the children had made it out of the home, but there was a moment where they were counting their many children and realized that Jackie, or John Wesley, was not among them. And then one of the townspeople saw from a window that Jackie had made his way to a window and was waving, and they were able to pull him out, and almost immediately after they pulled him out, the entire house collapsed. So it was truly a near-death experience. And this is also, they're not sure if Susanna or Samuel said this, but when John made it to his family, they quoted the scriptures, and they said that he was the fire plucked from the burning, that this was a moment where this young boy is destined for something great. And so I don't think God causes fires or suffering in that way, but it was one of those moments where, like, wow, like, so much of my life is shaped by United Methodism, and yet John Wesley could have not existed, or not existed, but he could have passed away as a 5-year-old, and we wouldn't have the movement we have today. And I thought that was really special, and it was really special experiencing it with a lot of other clergy, because they were like, wow, I guess I shouldn't complain about the nasty email I got from someone. They could have lit my house on fire. So it was a meaningful start to our trip.
Had the other clergy heard about the house fire?
I'm not sure. Honestly, we did not have any Wesley nerds on our trip. All of us were very eager and learning for the first time, which was funny because when I was at Duke, I definitely had classmates in my John Wesley courses that knew everything about John Wesley, and so I just kind of assumed I was going to be around people like that, but we were all just eager and learning for the first time, which I think allowed us to have some really interesting observations and experiences, like I said, it ended up being a lot more, and I'll get to that in other sections of our conversation, a lot more moving and emotional of a trip than I expected.
So, well said. So Susanna Wesley, the mother, this is a strong woman, strict disciplinarian for all of her children. She gave special care to Jackie, thinking he had been saved by God for some reason. But all of her children were, their home was their school, so she taught them everything that they learned growing up to prepare them for college. A home of deep devotion and serious religious discipline. I love a prayer that she wrote that goes like this: "Help me, O Lord, to remember that religion is not to be confined to the church or closet, nor exercised only in prayer and meditation, but that everywhere I am in thy presence. So may my every word and action have a moral content. May all the happenings of my life prove useful and beneficial to me. May all things instruct me and afford me an opportunity of exercising some virtue and daily learning and growing toward thy likeness. Amen." That prayer, if John heard that growing up, that's actually what he enacted, that part about religion is not to be confined to the church. And that was a signature of Wesley's life. Wesley went away to Oxford to study. And I love Oxford, but she has a different Oxford story than mine. My Oxford story, there I am with my daughter Sarah. We went to a pub there called the Eagle and the Child, sometimes named the Bird and the Baby. And I love this pub because this is where C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien and some other writers would gather once a week, and they would drink beer and they would read their latest writings to each other. So I imagine C.S. Lewis reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to these other authors. They're hearing it for the first time. The Lord of the Rings was first read out loud in this pub. Pretty cool place. And of course, I went to visit, I always go to graves, C.S. Lewis's burial, J.R.R. Tolkien's burial. But Taylor had a different experience of Oxford. So tell us about what you experienced there with these other clergy and our bishop.
So we were at Oxford on the day of the graduations. So it was actually really cool to see just the modern Oxford experience.
Did they give you a degree?
They did not give me a degree, but we were able to go to Christ Church, which was where John Wesley originally studied. We were not able to go to Lincoln, which was where he then studied. But it was really profound, and I think it was actually perfect that it was such a busy day on campus and there were so many college students, because it really made me think about what would it have been like for John Wesley to be a student and to kind of think about my own experience as a student. But John Wesley, he was formed so much by his peers in a way that I think I hadn't quite expected. we think of John Wesley, we think about him as the leader, and we just kind of assume that leaders have always been leaders. But the reality is John Wesley, like many of our leaders, were deeply formed by the people around them. And so Charles Wesley was one of the first people that formed him. John was kind of wayward at one point, and Charles wrote him a letter and said, I think you should start journaling. And John started journaling, and we know so much about John Wesley, and so much, we might not have had something that could turn into a denomination if it had not been for the journals that John Wesley kept, and that was a gift that Charles gave him. And Charles was the one that kept encouraging him to grow in his faith and to take his faith more seriously, and luckily, that didn't take much. John Wesley was very ready and apt to do that. But there was another friend, and this was the one that I think moved me the most. His name was Sir Morgan, and he was, I think, judging by his title, was probably a person of wealth. And he was at school with John, and he really encouraged John Wesley that if you're taking this seriously, you need to go to the prisons, you need to visit the sick. And so that became part of their Christian life together. And Sir Morgan died very young. He was ill. He was someone that had struggled with his health even while they were in school, and died in his mid-20s. So he's not someone that we hear about or think about. I don't think I had ever heard his name before. Yet so much of why I love being United Methodist is formed through that gift. And there's other friends along the ways that have formed John Wesley in that way. And the friendship they formed was really special. The vulnerability and the accountability that they had with one another. They asked each other really intense questions every time they checked in. And a lot of those things have continued to form me in how I think about ministry.
And college experience. Wesley and his friends in college, they weren't, let's go out drinking and play tennis. That's what was on my mind when I was in college. They were meeting early in the morning for prayer, for Bible study, going to prisons to visit. These guys, they were deadly serious about their Christianity, which was part of the challenge for Wesley. He was so deadly serious about his Christianity. That deadly seriousness was deadly for him, actually, as it turned out. So he decided to be a missionary abroad. English people were coming to America, so he came to Savannah. I told some of you this a while back. There's a John Wesley statue in Savannah, right down there near the river. Lisa and I were there one time looking at it. There were two other couples nearby, and I thought about it, and I looked at them and said, "Are you guys Methodist clergy?" And they said, "Yeah, how'd you know?" Nobody else stops there.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's the Wesley statue. So Wesley came to Savannah, and things did not go well. You wanted to talk some about that, right? His disappointments there?
Well, so I haven't actually been to Savannah, so that is my hopeful next part of, but I actually very recently kind of learned just how poorly it went, and I was like, oh my God, John Wesley. But I think you talk about Savannah, and I have some things to add about when he came back.
Well, so he tried to be a missionary there, and it just went bad. And partly they were going to convert the Indians. That was a brilliant scheme, of course. And it just didn't convert to Christianity. They were really disappointed by that. Tried to form a church there, and it was a deadly serious church. So you couldn't just come to communion. You had to have a ticket. They would interrogate you over how holy you had been. He got a girlfriend while he was there, because he was still single, named Sophie Hopke. They allegedly broke it off when he got on her nerves so much that she chased him down the street with scissors. So his father's parsonage had been set on fire. Single Wesley, as a minister, was chased down the street with his girlfriend with scissors. Things weren't going well, so he decided, this is a disaster, I'll go home. And on the way home, he's on a ship, and the ship is being tossed by sea, and they're pretty sure that they're going to die at sea. And that had a big impact on Wesley. Is that what you wanted to share about on his return journey?
Yeah, well, not his return journey, his worship after.
On the return journey, he's just panicked, and he thinks he's going to die, and he's happy to die because he's so sick. But he notices he's on board with some Moravians, and he notices the Moravians they're just cool and calm. They're at prayer, they're at peace, and he thought, whatever they have, I want that. He was moved by that. And in fact, he wound up spending a lot of time with Moravians once he got back to Europe, and that had a huge impact on him once he was home.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that's I love that he has been formed by so many people, which, when I learned about him, I was like, oh, he's just John Wesley, but he's been formed. But the thing that I learned that moved me on our pilgrimage in England was when he came back, he was just discouraged and feeling down and kind of unsure. And once again, so powerful to be experiencing this with young clergy, because unfortunately, there are a lot of young clergy that are at appointments that they're feeling really discouraged and they're feeling unsure about their future and where God's calling them or if God's still calling them to ministry. And so we went to St. Paul's Cathedral, which I didn't expect to be a part of our tour because that's not part of our typical, my expectation of what would be part of a United Methodist tour. But afterwards, our Bishop Carter shared that, once again, we only know this because of John Wesley's diaries, that John Wesley had went to a morning prayer vespers service or some time of midday prayer. And he had wrote afterwards that he felt like he was going through the motions and that he hadn't felt this connection and just continued feeling of discouragement and far from God. And that was the mood that John Wesley brought to the Aldersgate experience, which the Aldersgate experience is the experience that I remember, that I've heard talked about, that this conversion experience, I've spent a lot of time in my own faith thinking about, but I loved that wasn't the first attempt John Wesley had made that day to connect with God, and how, I don't know if I've ever tried twice to connect with God on a day when I was maybe feeling low. And so I just thought that was a really admirable sign of John Wesley's faith, and I think we have a lot. I have a lot more respect for him that he went to church twice rather than just being the kind of Christian that just seeks out these big emotional experiences. But one of the things that was surprising about this day was that Bishop Carter, he brought us all together, and he was like, I know you think Aldersgate is really special, and I'm actually here to say it might not be as special as you think it is. And at first I was like, oh no. And he shared, he's like, our denomination talks about it a lot, but John Wesley really didn't talk about it that much after it happened. And he's like, I would actually encourage you to de-emphasize the importance of this my heart has been strangely warmed moment in John Wesley's own faith, in the way that you talk to other people about their faiths, because the reality is not everybody will have a moment where God feels so life-changing clear to them, or that your life feels converted, and that's okay. We don't need to have those moments of faith in order to have robust spiritualities and connections with God. And I was grateful for that wisdom from Bishop Carter, but it also was really shocking. It was not what I expected when we stood in front of the Aldersgate flame. There's no longer the building, but they do have a statue. That's our group.
There's the Aldersgate flame.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's beautifully said. People talk about this all the time, heart being strangely warm. So then people say, my heart doesn't feel strangely warm. There must not be a God. I'm not connected to God. Wesley, that just wasn't a big thing for him going forward. It's been important for us as Americans. Why? We put a lot of stock in religious emotion. Wesley put a lot of stock in religious discipline. As we'll see. Wesley did, by the way, parenthetically, did eventually marry a woman named Molly. They really struggled to get along, and he actually wrote her a letter one time that I'll quote to you. He wrote some other things, and he wound up the letter like this. Molly, if you were wise, you would long ago have said to me, tell me what to do, and I will do it, instead of squabbling for these 10 years. This is now your duty, to obey me until I am an adulterer, and you can prove it. Your affectionate husband, John. There actually are a lot of letters like that, and she predeceased him in death, and he didn't make her funeral. He was not a strong family guy. Wesley was disciplined, though, and Methodism didn't come up because people kept having Aldersgate experiences. It was important for Wesley because then he understood for himself the first time that this religion is really a personal thing. This really is deep in your heart. It's everywhere. But then you got to act it out. So Wesley, he insisted that Methodists would be in small groups. You had to be in a small group, and you had to commit to go to the small group, and the small group was tough. It was an accountability group. You'd begin, and one person would be in the middle of the circle, and everybody had to answer the following question: have you sinned since we were last together? And no was probably not the right answer. So you had to confess your sin, and people would pray for you and help you figure out how to be better. There was that kind of discipline. There was great prayer discipline. Wesley kept a diary and encouraged everybody else to keep a diary, not just a it was called, it was called an exactor diary. Every hour, on the hour, you would stop and you would jot down notes of, have I had any unholy thoughts in the last hour? Have I missed an opportunity to do good in the last hour? Have I prayed to God? Have I trusted God in the last hour? And you make notes, and then the next hour you try to do a little better. He did this every day, every hour of his life. And we have records of many of those, which is super interesting. Wesley was disciplined. He rose every day at 5 a.m. and prayed for 2 hours before commencing the rest of his day. You young clergy do that, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Wesley was a vegetarian.
Me too.
Did you know that?
Yeah.
Not vegan, but he was a vegetarian. He was actually very devoted to health, and he actually wrote a book of medical cures. This is when medicine wasn't very advanced back in those days. She wrote a book of how to be healthy, how to eat well, how to cure various things. For instance, baldness. Mike, you could try this. The cure for baldness is you rub onion on the top of your head. Yeah. Try that later on. If you're hoarse, your throat's having a hard time, you rub the soles of your feet with garlic and such things. Wesley opened schools. He encouraged his people to teach young people. He believed education was a big deal. Publishing was huge for him. Music in the Methodist movement was enormous. His brother was a great hymn writer, wrote hundreds, thousands of hymns, many of which are our favorites in our hymnal today. Although we mercifully are spared the length of them, something like "Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing" in Charles Wesley's original, 17 stanzas. Like we're singing until 20 after. It's great. And I had just a lovely personal moment. My son and I were in London a few years back, and he wanted to visit soccer stadiums, and we did, in fact, visit soccer stadiums. But I said, we're going to Wesley's Chapel, which Taylor also went to. And Noah was then like, oh, I don't know Wesley's Chapel. He was moaning. So I texted Wesley, the guy who was the pastor there at the time. I said, I'm bringing my son by. He's not really a church guy. Give us like a super quick tour and we'll be out of your hair. Well, Wesley rose to the occasion. He decided, I know how to be a missionary to a kid that doesn't want to be here. So he walked in, and Noah starts chatting with him about soccer and tells him all these soccer players and coaches that he knows and that he's been a pastor to. And then we do the tour of the museum. And you come to Charles Wesley's organ, which is in this museum. This is a hands-off, you cannot get behind the barrier. He says, Noah, come back here and play Wesley's organ. It was just a funny moment. We had a blast. That was part of the strategy of the early Methodist movement. Things continued for Wesley. He continued to grow and branch out and learn new things. So this is a photo of that Taylor shared with me of what's called the New Room in Bristol. This is a bit to the north. I have not personally been to the New Room in Bristol, but tell us about the New Room and what y'all learned there.
Well, you should go because once again, the whole trip was surprise after surprise of how meaningful. But the New Room, absolutely felt like I've been to really holy places in this world, and the New Room was one of the holiest and most sacred places I feel like I've been. And I think a lot of that to do was with the company that I was with. But Bristol was a place that John Wesley had been encouraged once again by a friend. George Whitefield had invited him to be in his pulpit because John Whitefield was in the Americas and he was field preaching, and we owe a lot of the United Methodism as we know it in the United States to him. We field preaching. There were, of course, churches, and Wesley had started this movement that was drawing a huge following. There was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm. Of course, this created a crisis for the pastors of the churches who were doing the same old thing they'd done, and nobody was very enthusiastic about it. And so there began to be pushback, and Wesley would say, can I come and preach in your church? And they would say no. So Wesley would preach out in the cemetery.
outside the church. And that drew big crowds. So then Wesley decided, I'll go out in the fields where there are farmers and people would gather out in the fields and hear him preach. And then he thought, I'll go to the factories where people were working, and people streamed out of the factories to hear the preach. I mean, it was really fascinating. Like, he was not going to be confined to the church as his mother had prayed. We're going to take the gospel out to where people are. Partly in preaching, but then also in action. Where are the poor people? What are their needs? That's always been a signature of Methodism. And it seems obvious to us if we're United Methodists, but this isn't always obvious for every denomination, that we are here to lift up people in our communities and in the world. That's just part of what it means to be Methodist. Anyway, I was interrupting
thank you
you,
for that. Yeah. And one of the phrases that Bishop Carter shared with us that was a part of that formation for John Wesley was the encouragement from George Whitefield to be more vile, which is, and so that was kind of something that we clung on to as clergy, is because I don't think any of us wake up to go to our churches and think, today I want to be more vile. That's not necessarily something that I think we aspire to professionally, but that is exactly what John Wesley was encouraged by his friend to do so, and that was the energy that he brought to Bristol. And so Bristol was a town, like many parts of England at that point, that the slave trade was participating in, or the slave trade occurred there. And so he felt called, and one of the things that was a part of his ministry there was to speak and preach against slavery. This obviously was a very political thing to get involved in, a dangerous thing for John Wesley to get involved in. But it also was something that drew a lot of energy, and folks came. And so in that space, in the new room, that's the new room. There used to be another building there, but there were so many people that came to listen to John Wesley speak against slavery that the floor fell out. And in the rubble, as the floor had fallen out, John Wesley said, well, I guess we need to build a new room. And so they built a new room, and that's what they called the church, and the church is still called that today. The really cool thing about that space was it's just kind of a traditional worship space, but the upstairs was all the space that John Wesley and Charles Wesley and their friends studied, slept, wrote, lived. So there's just a lot of evidence of John Wesley's life, and they've done a beautiful job keeping it as a museum. And so you can learn a lot about United Methodism in that space. And they've bridged so much of, as we know, modern Methodism with kind of the foundational roots. And one of the cool things about that moment, and maybe why it was so powerful, is I was traveling with all these clergy in our conference, and we had a lot of clergy of color that were traveling with us, and it was so meaningful for me to stand alongside somebody like Stephanie Hand, who's a Black woman in our conference, just having such an emotional experience to, this is the church that I'm a part of. Like, I am a part of a church that has been for hundreds of years anti-racist in this way and has worked towards abolishing slavery, and the work that we still get to do together. And it was just a really profound moment of connectionalism and just reminders of the call that we have. And I think for me, it was just kind of a wake-up call that United Methodism is very radical, and that what ways, and have I not been vile? Have I not taken in this call and met people where they are? Am I more like the Church of England in the way I do ministry? And not to throw shade, but in that time. So I don't know, it was really special. I encourage, if you're in that part of England, I do think it's actually a cafe, just like us. So maybe we are onto something.
You know, William Wilberforce people usually chalk up the end of slavery to him. He was the one that kind of turned the tide. Well, John Wesley was the one who had the impact on William Wilberforce to work within the United Kingdom for the abolition of slavery. And that reminds me of in that day in England, slavery was the hot political issue. It was kind of what's the hot political issue today? Like, is it pro-choice, immigration? I mean, whatever it is. Slavery was the hot issue in that day, and Wesley spoke out loud. What is God's word with respect to this. So if John Wesley heard us say today, oh, religion and politics don't mix, he'd laugh out loud. He talked about all issues that mattered in the world and changed the world for the better because he had the courage to do so, and church people felt we're the ones who were supposed to lead the way on these issues of the day. I want to chat a little bit about Wesley's theology, not too much. Hearing Taylor talk is even cooler. I mentioned John Wesley, the group accountability, that meant so much. He talked about means of grace. It's not just, okay, God's grace, that's kind of a thing. You avail yourself of the means of grace. One is holy conversation. You talk to people about God. You talk to people who are trying to see God's grace in you and in your life. Fasting, this is not something that people like to do very much. Fasting is a means of grace. You do without consuming for a time in prayer. That is a means of grace. Other means of grace. That was a big deal for Wesley. A cool, interesting thing about his theology, Wesley came along at a time that probably the most popular version of Christianity in Europe in those days was Calvinism, sort of the ancestors of the Presbyterians. Presbyterians, by the way, they're so not John Calvin. We're kind of John Wesley. They're so not John Calvin, but they can't help it, bless them. Anyway, so sort of the core of Calvinist theology was it gets this acronym TULIP, that they believed in total depravity. You're totally depraved, and Wesley agreed with that. You're just broken. You're sinful. You can't really help it. You can't get out of it. Unconditional election. God chooses people. God gives God's grace. It's unconditional. You don't earn it. You don't deserve it. You didn't do anything to pick it. You just receive God's grace. They believed in limited atonement. Some would be atoned for by God, and some would not. Wesley vehemently disagreed with this. He believed that God's atonement was for all people. That's a big deal. And then irresistible grace. John Calvin taught that God's grace is irresistible. You can't resist it. And Wesley, he knew in his own heart that for people that he deserved, you can resist God's grace. That's a thing. God gives you this capacity to resist God's grace. Then the perseverance of the saints. So Wesley reacted to those things. One of his primary beliefs was what we would call prevenient grace. God's grace always comes before anything that we do, think, feel about God. So it's not like we're neutral and then, I choose God. I choose God's grace. If you choose God's grace, what got you to choose God's grace was God's grace. The reason you exist and are breathing is by the grace of God. So grace always comes before, and grace is always and everywhere for all people and in all of creation. To me, that's part of the beauty of Wesley's theology, especially in the face of those who want to limit God's grace. That becomes a big deal in a lot of Charles Wesley's hymns. Wesley had a cool image that I like of repentance being the porch, faith being the door, and holiness being the house, right? So you want to go in the house. You want to be at home. Repentance, that's the first step. You go through the door, faith, but then the life is one of holiness. That was important for Wesley. Are we leading holy lives? Are you sanctified by God's Spirit? That doesn't just mean you grit your teeth and try to do better. God's Spirit works in you to make a more Christ-like person within. God motivates you to do and to be good. Absolutely lovely. Wesley talked a lot about going on to perfection. When you were ordained, they ask you, how do they phrase that question? Are you being made perfect in love and holiness in this life? What did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, everybody answers yes. It's tough pressure. So perfection, the Bible actually talks about perfection. Are you perfect? That's a different thing. Although I heard an old joke from an old preacher years ago who's died. Somebody asked him about going on to perfection. He said, if you're not going on to perfection, where are you going? Which is a great question. Wesley talked a lot about inward and outward holiness. So inward holiness is being attentive to little attitudes. It's the kind of thing that Jesus talked about. Have you killed? No. Do you harbor anger in your heart? Yes. That's inward holiness, to be attentive to that. Have you committed adultery? Do you have lust in your heart? That's inward holiness. Racism. That's an inward holiness question. But then there's also outward holiness, is what do we do for the poor? What do we do for children who need to be educated? And so on. All that's very important. Wesley talked a lot, this is the last thing, a lot about what he called a Catholic spirit. You know, in our creed, we say the one holy Catholic church. So some people get bent out of shape, like, I don't like those Roman Catholics. You should actually love your Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. But the word Catholic just means what we share in common with other Christians. And Wesley said we should have a Catholic spirit. Methodists and their DNA don't get up in the morning and say, we're right and everybody else is wrong. Methodists get up in the morning, we actually find good ways to share with others who believe a little bit differently. And I love the thing that Wesley did. The Methodist movement was taking off, and it had spread to America, and it had spread to Europe. It was going gangbusters. But then some of the leaders began to argue with each other over how things should go. It's the only time in the history of Methodism that's ever happened, but it's a joke. They were having arguments over what to do, and when Wesley heard about this, he wrote these people a letter, and I love what he said in his letter. He said, it's fine if you disagree and talk, he said, but the beginning of your disagreement is this: you must say all the good you can of the other person, and then that person must say all the good that they can about you. And once you've done that, then you can talk to each other. I love that idea. So we come now to later in Wesley's life. He lived a long time and finally died on March the 2nd of 1791. You want to talk some about that?
Yeah, well, the last letter he wrote was to Wilberforce, encouraging him to keep fighting to end slavery. I was really moved by that. I hadn't known that, and he was a man who health was a really high priority for him, and I think there's evidence in his longevity. But he used every day of his life to continue to seek for justice, and he was completely devoted to the church. And I think you're going to talk about this, but he chose to be near his mother's grave, and I love the relationship he had with her and the way in which she continued to inspire him throughout his ministry. And he's someone that it's easy to look up to and be proud of being a part of his denomination.
In the world in those days, they always had these idealized portraits of someone dying, right? So the idea was that you would have a good death, and a good death, you're surrounded by people, and you offer your soul up to God in an act of great piety. So this art developed around Wesley's death. It's probably not entirely accurate, but anyway, he's dying, and when he was on his deathbed, he had been quiet for quite a few days, and they were just on the watch waiting for him to die, and then he surprised everyone. I don't know if you've ever been with someone who's dying and they didn't speak for a while, and then suddenly came out with something. What he came out with was pretty interesting. He sang a hymn. His brother Charles was probably annoyed. He'd already died. Charles had died 3 years before. It wasn't one of Charles's hymns, but it was a hymn by Isaac Watts. And out of the blue, he sang, "I'll praise my Maker while I have breath, and when my soul is lost in death, praise shall employ my nobler powers." That's amazing. I'll praise my Maker while I have breath, but when I die, I'll continue to praise God in eternity. And then his last words were, "The best of all is God is with us." The Divinity School, that's carved over the big stairwell in the new building. The best of all, God is with us. So I love that. So Wesley died in 1791. Great man, big legacy, and we're here. And Wesley would say it's not about Wesley. It's all about God. It's all about Jesus. We're just one manifestation of that happened to work at a certain point in time in history. But there are cardinal things in Methodism that I treasure and always will. I didn't grow up Methodist. I chose. I thought, I'll be something. I'll be United Methodist. Everything I learned about it, I liked. So that signature stuff on the prevenient grace and putting faith into action, being ecumenically minded, really, really works for me. And I think it's a gift that we have to offer to the world today. What else about Wesley?
I want to echo what you said about I kind of grew up Methodist. My parents were kind of accidental Methodists because we had a really great children's ministry and at the church that I grew up at. And when I was in high school, my associate pastor, he's like, "You're Wesleyan." And I was like, "What does that mean?" Because I didn't even know who John Wesley was. And he's like, "It just seems like the things you believe are in line with what it means to be United Methodist." And I would agree that just as I've uncovered more and more about what it means to be United Methodist, I've just been excited. And so I love that I'm in my 6th year of ministry, and I'm still learning things that make me excited. And so one of the things that about this experience was, as I reflected on my own journey of being United Methodist, I started thinking about my young adult ministry, that's a big part of my job here, and I realized, I don't actually know what their relationship to United Methodism is, and if they even identify as being United Methodist. And so when I came back, one of the projects that I was really excited about is I made a lot of what this conversation has been into curriculum that our young adults are using to talk about what it means to be United Methodist, because the reality is a lot of our young adults will live in Charlotte for a season of their life, and they may move to another place, and my hope is that they will choose to be United Methodist in the next town that they go to, and that there might not be Myers Park United Methodist for the rest of their lives, but they may be, but they would choose to be a part of our denomination and be formed. And we only had 1 week, and it has already been so exciting seeing just their openness and their excitement, and just seeing people for the first time learn some of these stories and be like, "That's so cool and so relevant." And I've just been really grateful. So yeah, if you are interested, this is our packet. I probably won't ask them, but one of the small group weeks does have the questions of examination. So we'll start with when was the last time you sinned? So we'll see. Might scare them away.
Another conversation for another day would just be kind of the meaning of denominations in our world. But I had this picture back in the 50s. I've even heard this. People, you were Methodist, you married a Methodist. If you didn't, you had to settle which church, and then that's what you were for the rest of your life. And that's long broken down for various reasons. People pick a church based on that church where they are. Methodist churches are not all alike. There aren't carbon copies of one another. And we live in an anti-institutional age where people don't trust big institutions. We're still part of one. And I'm proud that we're still part of one, because we can do so many things because of our connection. Things that would have made Wesley really happy. A parade example is when Ukraine was invaded, refugees fled into Poland, and we could immediately connect with the church there and begin to support refugees at that great distance. It was just a beautiful thing, the kind of thing that we're able to do.
Can I add one thing about Connectionism? So all the new clergy that were invited, so it was all the recent ordinands in the last 3 years. And part of our class, we had 3 members of our class that were from different parts of the world. So there was 2 African students and a student from Nepal. And yes, which we love. He's local. Yeah. Actually, I think all of them may be. But anyway, so we were in Epworth, which is where John Wesley grew up, and we were able to hold the chalice that John Wesley received his first communion from. And it was a very holy, very spiritual, it was just a meaningful experience, and Bishop Carter asked us to remember a moment of grace in our lives as we held the chalice. And afterwards, we came out, we were standing in the cemetery, and Bishop Carter asked people to share and this was only day 2 of our trip, what the trip had meant to us. And one of our students who, through Connectionism, so someone from the globally connected to United Methodism that has come to the Western North Carolina Conference, said, "I'm so grateful to have experienced my heritage, my shared heritage, to find out where I've come from with my brothers and sisters of grace." And that was so surprising and moving for me, because I probably have English heritage, like many of us in the room. And so for me, I was like, oh, this really could be my heritage. But this was someone who had no biological heritage to the space that we were standing in, but had such a powerful experience of spiritual heritage that we were all sharing together. And that really meant the world to me. And I was like, oh, what a cool denomination.
I first heard the name John Wesley when I was in college. I've told somebody this story before. I started going to this Episcopal church with my college buddies, and they had this young priest there who was just so charismatic, and I loved to listen to him talk. And almost every time he preached, he referred to somebody named John Wesley in a praiseworthy way. And so I kept thinking, I need to make a note and follow up and learn who this guy is one day. Yeah, got a lot of that later on. All right, this is kind of our basic Wesley presentation, why we love John Wesley. Do you have questions that Taylor can field? Yes?
What is the method?
Yeah, I meant to mention that. The tag Methodist originally was a little bit of a jab of derision. It was like, oh, there were two things that they said about the early Methodists. One, they said, oh, they're enthusiastic. I mean, that was, in prim, proper British society, to get all excited about God was regarded as, oh, gosh, they're enthusiastic. They made fun of them for that. And then they also said they're Methodists. In that, Wesley had a method, right? It's not just like show up for church, you got a pulse, you were baptized, you're a Christian forever. There's this method. You keep this journal all day, you fast, you read your Bible, you go serve in a prison, and you must do these things to be a Christian. So that was kind of a mocking thing, like, oh, they have a method. What stuck, and Wesley was happy for that to stick because there was a method. He knew there needed to be a method to live a life that is holy and honors God. So that's a great question. Thank you. Yes?
I'd love to learn more about the hymns that he wrote. And I don't know much at all, but approximately how many hymns did he write? Did he sing all of them today? Maybe that's too granular for it.
So I think he wrote 6,500 hymns. I mean, this is what he did, right? And it was kind of day and night. And that sounds like a lot of hymns. What's amazing to me about it is, I'm going to say this wrong. I'll try it anyway. Charles Wesley's hymns are never praise be to Jesus over and over and over. They're multi-stanzas, and each line is packed with theology and well-developed poetry with images. It's powerful stuff, Soar we now where Christ has led. That didn't just pop into your head, right? Soar, right? And so he was a poet and a musician, but also a brilliant theologian. There's so much that's packed into those hymns. So that might be something that we could actually do one day. We could sing some Wesley hymns. I don't know how many Charles Wesley hymns are in our hymnal. There might be 40, but I'm guessing. But he wrote over 6,000 hymns. Yeah. And a lot of them are longer than the versions that we have. So he was really productive. But they sang these. This was a big deal for the Methodist movement. You came together. They believed that you learned theology through singing. You didn't just sing because it felt good and it was fun. You actually were learning as you were singing a hymn, and they would commit the hymns to memory, and then that theology would become a part of them. And it used to be a big deal for United Methodists in the United States within, say, my grandparents' lifetime, that people would own a hymnal at home, and whether they could play a piano or whatever, that those hymns were part of their devotional life in the home, which is super interesting. All right, anything else? We're losing the yoga people.
Just an observation. I've got a little bit of reading about Wesley. And the bottom line, which we forget, is the bottom line is that he was an incredible missionary. And I can't remember they estimated how many miles he rode on a horse.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, it's like around the earth once or something.
Yeah.
Just an amazing number of miles, rain, sleet, snow. That by himself, he was flying along with dirt roads all over England.
Yep.
Telling people about God. Just how a man who would do that distance. How a man was so driven that he
And no wonder he didn't have much of a marriage. This was somebody that wasn't devoted to hearth and home. He was
Yep.
devoted to being on the road and being in mission. And I read somewhere, so Francis Asbury duplicated this in America, right? So Francis Asbury became kind of the John Wesley of America. And I read somewhere, George Marsden, right, wrote a biography of him, and he said, I don't know how they figure such things. They believe he was the most traveled man in America because he was the same thing. He was just constantly going one place to another. And they said when he died in the late 1700s, more people had seen him and would have recognized him than anybody else in America.
Wow.
Like George Washington, got around some, but not like that. But Francis Asbury was always traveling, always meeting with large groups of people in little towns and large cities, and so many people had seen him. Whereas not that many people had seen Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. Maybe they'd seen a print of a painting or something, but they'd actually seen Francis Asbury. Fascinating.
When I was looking at that, the man on the horseback, the silhouette sort of, I always thought that was in America until I started reading about it.
Oh.
It just came to America once.
Yep.
I think that's wrong.
Wesley? Oh, yeah, no, and that was a disaster, right? So, yeah. Not try
He had a
that
bad
again.
time.
Leave that to others.
Yep.
And he wasn't trying to form a new denomination. It's not like he thought, we need a new separate body in the church. He didn't want there to be a separate body in the church. He was attempting the reform and the revolution and the reigniting of the church that existed.
Yep.
It broke his heart that there was division. And there probably wouldn't have been if it weren't for the Revolutionary War, but that's another story. Yeah.
I'm envious that the youth are looking into, the accountability
Yeah.
idea and the idea of, admitting or being bold. I mean, if you talk about your sin, you're being bold. It's a part. And at first when you said vile, have I been vile? I thought that's just weird.
Yeah.
The more I think about it, and I know adults can't join the youth, but I must tell you that this last year, and it's not just this building, but I feel this kind of energy and movement with youth, and I'm somewhat envious.
Yeah.
I took high school seniors to Israel last summer. Yeah. And unwitting adults have said, oh, God, that sounds terrible. High school, they were so cooperative. I'd say, we're leaving at 5:15 tomorrow morning. Yes, sir. They got up and went. What was more impressive was the depth of their spirituality and knowledge of the Bible. I mean, they put our adults in the shade. I was amazed at the depth of faith in these teenagers.
Yes.
It is remarkable what's being birthed out of this church. Anyway.
Yeah, there's not one demographic with a more robust discipleship plan than our youth, which is really special. And it shows in their faith and their leadership and the way in which they're living on in college and into young adulthood. It's really, y'all should be proud.
Oh, gosh, yeah. All right, friends who made it to noon, thank you for coming. Appreciate it so much.